House taking new steps to try to fulfill another one of President Trump's campaign promises, ending the war in Ukraine. Sources telling CNN top administration officials are set to travel to Saudi Arabia in the coming days for a meeting with senior Russian officials. This as President Trump's special envoy to Russia and Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, makes clear Europe will not be part of those talks. CNN's Betsy Klein broke this story. She joins us now from West Palm Beach, Florida, with more details. Betsy, what more are you learning?
Well, Paula, moments after President Trump spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin last week, he indicated that he wanted those talks to end Russia's war in Ukraine to begin, quote, immediately. And to that end, we have learned that he is dispatching 3 of his top lieutenants to speak with high-level Russian officials. That includes, according to 2 sources familiar with the plans, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Special Envoy to the Middle East Steve Witkoff, who will travel to Saudi Arabia, one source tells us in the coming days, declining to say when specifically. But our colleague Matthew Chance says that the Kremlin has also begun assembling its own high-level contingent of staffers, and that's going to include top political, intelligence, and economic officials. Now, President Trump told reporters days ago that he could soon, depending on the status of these talks, meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin himself, and that meeting could happen, quote, in the not-too-distant future. He suggested it would also take place in Saudi Arabia and indicated that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman could be involved in those discussions. Of course, the Crown Prince has been a key interlocutor between the U.S., Russia, and Saudi Arabia and Ukraine. One party that won't be at the negotiating table, according to Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, General Keith Kellogg, is the Europeans. But Kellogg did indicate that Ukraine will be at the negotiating table. Of course, when and in what capacity remains unclear at this time. Kellogg also indicated Sunday that Russia is going to have to make concessions. Take a look.
To me, there's going to have to be things like territorial concessions as well. Okay, some of it is unrealistic to expect where you'd want to go to, but it's territorial, it's sub-territorial. It could be the engagement of refusing to use force, renouncement of the use of force into the future from a political side. He's not going to downsize his military forces, hopefully get rid of. What we're going to try to do is basically force him into actions. What you want to do is force him to actions maybe he's uncomfortable with.
Now, we have seen President Trump take steps to dramatically reshape U.S. foreign policy as it pertains to Russia and Ukraine, and also take steps toward rebuilding relations with President Putin. But certainly very critical, high-stakes talks in the coming days. We'll be watching quite closely, Paula.
Betsy Klein, thank you. And joining me now to discuss this, CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier. Kim, what do you make of this move to cut out Europe from these negotiations?
Well, it's a surefire way to infuriate Paris, the Germans, the Brits, because they have been part of supporting Ukraine up till now. And the Germans and the French were part of the Minsk agreement that helped bring some amount of peace. Of course, it didn't last in eastern Ukraine before. And they've been putting a lot of their blood and treasure on the line, at least treasure in terms of and providing weapons to Ukraine. So getting cut out like this just after getting bawled out by Vice President J.D. Vance in his Munich Security Forum speech, that's how many people took that speech, this is unwelcome news.
What power do European leaders have at this point in ensuring Ukraine does not get steamrolled in these negotiations?
Well, that's one of the things that President Zelensky was trying to point out to the audience, saying, you know, Ukraine is part of Europe and we have to band together because we can't count on the U.S. For our security, possibly in future. He was fairly blunt about it in his speech and in remarks afterwards that the White House had become an unstable sort of arbiter of this, that he was working with carefully, and he was urging all assembled to stand up a European army and start thinking about going it alone against Russia and arming Ukraine to be the front lines of that potential future fight.
What is he doing there when he calls for the creation of an army in Europe to deter Putin? Is that realistic, or is it simply a way to just get under Putin's skin?
Well, the majority of European countries are part of NATO, and their defense expenditures are spent less on internal defense and more on being part of NATO training ranks, et cetera, to be able to respond to some sort of future threat. And that's why Donald Trump has been urging them all to spend more money on their own defenses. So, this is an uncomfortable suggestion from Zelensky. It's an uncomfortable amount of berating from Trump, but both sides are saying, for various reasons, you've got to start thinking about spending more on your own defense because in Zelensky's case, he was warning Russia won't stop with Ukraine, especially if Russia is allowed to keep large parts of Ukraine. And I have to tell you, a lot of European officials I've spoken to firmly believe that, agree with Zelensky, and think that the Trump administration might be offering up too much too fast to a Moscow that's just going to take it, agree with it, and then in 2 or 3 years, break those agreements and invade somewhere in Europe or more of Ukraine again.
I want to play an interesting moment from my colleague Christiane Amanpour's interview with President Zelensky this morning, where he revealed one of the things he actually told Trump during their phone call. Let's take a listen.
As was reported, President Trump, that Putin is only doing this and agreeing to talks because he's afraid of Trump. Did you tell him that?
Yes. I told Trump that Putin afraid of him. Yes, and he heard me. And now Putin knows.
The comedic timing in that answer on full display. But what do you make of that? Is he hoping this will influence Trump's relationship with the Kremlin?
Look, part of this is every leader or official I've spoken to who has dealt with Trump knows that they have to flatter his ego. But Trump is also known for being mercurial, angry, vengeful, proudly so that what Ukrainian officials I've spoken to hope is that Trump will put a lot of trust in Putin, and then Putin will early on break one of these agreements, make Trump angry, and that will cause Trump and the White House to then fully support Ukraine as the Biden administration once did. That's a whole lot of strategizing, but other than that, it's kind of like what can they hope for? Kyiv will not survive without U.S. support in addition to European support because the Russians can mass so many forces in terms of people, and its weapons manufacturing has been boosted inside the country and by supplies from Iran, North Korea, and logistical supplies from China. And that's a lot for Europe to compete with to help Ukraine.
Kim Dozier, thank you.
Thanks.
And ahead, why